Hello, and welcome to today's NEASC Virtual Global Forum. 9 big questions schools must ask to avoid going back to normal, because normal wasn't that great to begin with. I'm Allison Geary, Deputy Director of the NEASC Commission on Public Schools. My co-host today is Jeff Bradley, Director of the NEASC Commission on International Education. We are so pleased to have with us today 2 people whose names may be very familiar to you already. Homa Tavanger and Will Richardson. As co-founders of the Big Questions Institute, Will and Homa are working with educators to reflect on and explore the experience, purpose, and practice of school, and how to push beyond reactive problem solving to chart a viable, vibrant path to the future for all learners. And now I'd like to hand things over to my co-host Jeff to get things started.
Thank you, Allison. NEASC began this virtual global forum series more than a year ago. We countered a global pandemic with our global forum. Just as when facing darkness, you don't curse it, you light a candle. Today, many of us around the world are beginning to see a light at the end of this dark tunnel. In fact, that may be many lights, flashlights, in the hands of explorers like Will and Homa, helping to guide schools and learners into a better and brighter future on the other side, more relevant, more equitable, more impactful, more just schools. And like good learners and good explorers, they are posing good questions. I've been privileged to know Will and Homa over the years through various conferences and other interactions. And their approach toward appreciative inquiry, storytelling for school change, and redefining the 3 R's have drawn a lot of attention here in the US and abroad. And we are fortunate to have them here with us today to shine some of their lights on some of the issues that we face in the months and years ahead in our schools. I'll join back toward the top of the hour for some Q&A, but for now, Homa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, Allison, NEASC. It has been really wonderful to develop this relationship with you as you are also asking big questions about the future of schools and what matters in learning. And so we are also thrilled to join you and thrilled by the incredible turnout today and the incredible representation from across the globe. I think this has definitely been one of the silver linings through this very, very difficult time that we've been living in. And we also really appreciate the hundreds of questions that came through for this webinar, the thousands of questions we've received over the past 14 months or so at the Big Questions Institute. We are all about asking the questions, leaning in with fearless inquiry. And, we think this is the time to shake things up a little bit. Before we go into what that could look like, we do want to sort of pause and honor this moment and the hard work that all of you have really been doing. And so we want to acknowledge this, how difficult this has been. And this has been hard, and it is hard. It remains difficult to be staying in the classroom or steering the ship of the school through so many, many challenges. And the challenges, the context that we're living in globally that is creating the conditions that are causing us to really question what are we doing in schools, what is the purpose, and has spurred us to ask our 9 big questions and share with all of you. And before we go into that sort of macro picture, this picture sort of represents these great existential challenges from climate to coronavirus, economic inequality, democracy, racial justice that we must face in our schools. We do want to pause and recognize that it's also been exhausting personally. And every study among educators shows that people are exhausted. They feel mentally and physically on the brink. Out of this recent study, only about 8% of educators said they felt okay. So to have 92% not feeling okay is the context that we're working in. And at the same time, our students, our children are also really struggling. The mental health reality is the backdrop on which we work, against which we work. And we also want to say, using this wisdom from Adrienne Maree Brown, who is an activist and teacher, educator, who talks about this reality that in truth, things are not getting worse, but they are getting uncovered. So what do we do in light of this? We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. As difficult as it is to uncover the uncomfortable questions, this stance, this disposition of pulling back the veil is sort of the approach that we take to learning, recognizing, and this is what we mean by things were not that great to begin with. So another teacher that we have learned a great deal from is Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer and activist, who discusses how at the very beginning of the pandemic, she identified that the pandemic really is a portal. And what that means is that historically, as she describes, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. So this pandemic is no different from those past pandemics. We also embrace this idea that it is a portal. It's a gateway between that world that we had been living in, often sort of asleep, going through the motions, and the next world that we will be entering. And so we now have this choice. Do we choose, and Arundhati Roy's language is very dramatic. She talks about, do we drag the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, data banks, dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us? Do we carry all that with us? It is a heavy weight to drag, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And so we must imagine that world. We must think about what is worth carrying through the portal and what are we going to fight for. So we're not saying that we want to throw out everything about school, but we want to maintain a clear-eyed vision of what's worth carrying with us and what we will fight for. And we've seen examples throughout this pandemic of educators really striving to do just that. And Will is going to walk us through that.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to NEASC again for hosting us today. We really appreciate it. And it is a powerful moment when you think about all the things that are happening right now. And it's a powerful moment for schools as well. We are in what some people call a hinge moment, where so many things are changing very quickly, and schools are changing as well. And a lot of change has happened in the last 14 months that has been forced upon us in many ways. What we want to do is also, though, explore some of the changes that may be an opportunity here for us as we begin, as Jeff said, to see the light at the end of the tunnel, although we acknowledge that there are still many places in the world that are struggling mightily with the coronavirus and other issues that are going on. We're not certainly anywhere near to being out of the woods yet, but hopefully the arc is shifting a little bit more upward. But one of the things we have been struck with in this last year and working with international school people and certainly lots of educators here in the US is that as powerful and as difficult as this moment has been, it has also been this kind of very powerful learning moment that we've had, and that the learning has been profound. And what if we can step back from it, I think what most of us would agree is that The really important lesson that we have taken from this in an education and learning context is that when it's real world, when it's relevant, when it's collaborative, when it's driven by inquiry and passion and problem solving and shared, that is absolutely powerful learning. It is, in fact, the best learning that we can do because it is meaningful to us and we understand the implications of it. We understand why we need to learn it. And, you know, as I said, we've had the great opportunity of working with a number of people from around the world. I've actually had the honor of helping to lead a conversation among international school heads for the last 58 weeks now. And the conversations that we've had have been pretty amazing when you think about the almost minute to minute problem solving that all of you have had to do. And to be a part of those ongoing conversations was pretty incredible. And what I often remind many of these leaders is this idea that this has been a profoundly powerful moment for learning. And when we talk about the learning that we've done, everybody kind of nods their heads and say, yeah, this has been maybe the most learning I've done in my life in the shortest amount of time. And then what I will say, though, to them in a way of challenging them is, if your learning has been that powerful and really that meaningful in the last 14 months, how does it map to the learning that your students are doing in your classrooms? How are they doing relevant, real world, inquiry-based problem solving that is meaningful to them in the moment? And the answer often, more often than not, is, yeah, they're really not. There's a dissonance, there's a gap between the learning that we've done as individuals this year and the ways that our students are learning in the classroom. And one of the things that I found interesting about this particular group, and one of the stories that we tell, is that almost immediately in these conversations, there was a group that kind of wanted to have another conversation. And that was around this idea that we can't continue to do school the way that we've been doing it, that school in its current iteration is not relevant to this moment, certainly, and not relevant to what appears to be an increasingly kind of no normal, uncertain future. And so a group of them dropped out and we started having Friday conversations, and Homa and I were lucky enough to lead those groups as well. And they developed this, this set of principles. This is the AIE New School Project, where they said, these are this is our pledge. These are the things that we want to work on moving forward, because we really feel like this moment is changing so much of what we understand about our role, our value, what we need to be in our students' lives. And it's a pretty ambitious way of thinking differently about schools. And now we're in the hard part. Now we're in the, how do we live these principles? These principles took months, almost 9 months, to produce and to really interrogate. And now we're at the point with this group where we're saying, how do we begin to live these principles? And that's where it gets interesting. And that's really where it gets very difficult as well. Now, I think that a lot of the reason that we've been engaged in these questions and why so many people are asking questions about this moment is that whether we're kind of open about it or not, we all feel this kind of uncertainty or this dissonance with what normal has been. And that's why, again, the tagline to the book is, normal wasn't that great to begin with. I mean, normal is what has led us to this moment. And in a moment that's so fraught with so many different things going on, I think we have to look at normal and ask ourselves some real truths about the way that normal has stacked up, not just in our lives in general here on this planet, because certainly the issues that we're facing go way beyond education right now. But as a group of educators coming together, this is our work. Our work is to take a look and ask, what is normal in schools right now? And to be really honest about it. And this is where the hard part is. And this is going to be the most challenging part of this presentation right now, because I have a feeling I'm going to make many of you uncomfortable, but don't leave, sit with it, all right? Because I think we need to at least acknowledge some of these truths that maybe we haven't acknowledged, or at least we've felt, but we haven't articulated out loud. And so I want to go there with you, and I want to really push you. So look, normal in schools, as we think about schools in their current iteration, normal in schools is basically a curriculum that's forgotten as soon as the test is over. And we know this is true because most of the curriculum that we quote unquote learned in school, we forgot as soon as the test is over. And there are lots of schools that have begun to do little experiments with bringing kids back 6 months after a final exam and having them take it again, and then seeing how much more poorly they did on that second iteration because they had basically forgotten it. Normal in schools is kids learning how to get a good grade over everything else. I don't think I mentioned, but I own 2 children. They're in their early 20s now, but this is what they did really well in school. They learned how to get a good grade. They learned how to play the game of what do I need to, get these particular points, or how do I please this particular teacher? And that's normal. Normal is a lesson rather than discovery. Normal in schools is that it's pretty much pre-planned, it's packaged up, it's meted out in lockstep. We pretty much have a sense of where you're going to be on, April 10th. This is what we're going to be studying because that's the map. Normal in schools is an unnatural segregation by age. No one in the real world learns only with people their own age. If I said to the 500 plus of you, you can only learn with the people who are 35 years old, you would be like, why? Why would we do that? Normal also is this idea that everybody learns in 45-minute or 80-minute chunks, right? And again, that doesn't reflect the way we do it in the real world. That doesn't happen. As soon as we leave school, we don't learn science for 45 minutes and then read Shakespeare for 45 minutes and then, speak French for 45 minutes. Normal in schools is also an inequitable access to modern learning tools. And we saw this writ large this year in the forced movement or the forced transition over to a digital learning environment. A lot of kids were left in the dust, left behind because they didn't have access. It's not equitable. Stories here in the States of kids sitting in McDonald's parking lots or Chick-fil-A parking lots trying to get Wi-Fi so they can hand in their homework. Normal in schools is silos of knowledge that rarely connect. Again, we, in the last 14 months, as you problem solved through this moment, there was no curriculum where you had to learn this piece and then this piece and then this piece. It was just, there was no curriculum. You had to learn your way through it. And one day it was math, and then it was communication skills, and then it was just fluid in the ways that those things came together. Normal in schools is a lot of surveillance, and that is an issue right now in the world in general, in our lives in general, but certainly increased surveillance happened over the last year because of all the technology and the ways in which those are being meted out. It's an emphasis on teaching, not learning. If you look at the professional development programs of most schools and most districts around the world, you'll see it's a focus on how do we teach better, not how we learn better. It's a lack of relevance in many ways to the modern world. We have a little hashtag we use called the new curriculum, where we talk about algorithmic literacy, we talk about cryptocurrencies, we talk about all these things that are happening in the world right now that aren't in the curriculum, that our kids are going to have to figure out on their own. It's about white explorers, white scientists, white authors, and white histories by and large, depending on where you are. It's almost all about that. It's also about anxious, stressed, depressed children. Even before the even before the COVID came, our kids were anxious, our kids were stressed, and we've been seeing those numbers tick up pretty consistently. And now, especially, I think there's a challenge for us to make sure that well-being is at the center of our work. It's an increasing illiteracy to recognize misinformation. Certainly here in the United States, we are very challenged right now by trying to figure out who to believe and where truth is in the world. It's self-worth as measured by numbers, and it's also power over as opposed to power with. And I know that is a long list of normals that may feel uncomfortable, but we've been kind of trotting these out now for the last 2 or 3 months, and I don't think you'll be surprised to hear we don't get a lot of pushback in terms of people saying, no, that's not right. Most people just kind of silently nod their heads and go, yeah, you know what? That is pretty much what normal looks like. And that then begs the question, why do we want to go back to that? Why do we want to, when we say, I just want to get back to normal? Well, why? Why do we want to get back to that? And so this is an opportunity for us to kind of rethink it, to pull it apart, and to peel all of those layers back and get to the foundation of our work and then build it back up from there. And that's really why we wrote the book on the 9 big questions, which Homa is going to break down for us now.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I know that's a lot for people to take in, and it's a lot for us as well. And that is partly how this book just sort of came together really sort of organically, because we were asking all these questions, and we're deeply concerned about the great challenges that educators and students have for facing the future. We have a link on this slide because, and NEASC has been putting in the chat, this is a free download. We want you to have these conversations. We want you to share this with as many people as you know and you wish, with your whole staff, and start having these conversations. So where do we go from here? What is the power of questions? And we love this quote from Peter Block, who talks about this idea that questions that have the power to make a difference, that's what we hope these questions do. Make a difference. These are the questions that engage people in an intimate way, confront them with their freedom, and invite them to co-create a future possibility. And so take this as an invitation. We want you to co-create with us, with your community, with whatever learning communities you're in. What is that future that we don't go back to all that has been broken? And so we're going to walk you through these questions real quick. And the very first question, which I sort of alluded to earlier, is what is sacred? So even though we acknowledge all these normals that are broken, we are not saying throw everything out. But if you do an honest assessment, excuse me, an honest appraisal of what matters the most, your path forward will be much clearer. And so you start with the question of what is sacred about schools, and it creates this incredible sort of shared vision and unity for moving forward. And that is one of the really useful tools to practice the disposition of fearless inquiry. So after what is sacred, we transition to what is learning. And that really is, that's got to be a foundation. But how many times do you really ask what is learning? How often do you have a shared definition of this basic reason that we're at school? And then we go to the next question. Yes. So we're going to give you a little look inside. When you ask what is learning, what might that look like?
Yeah, and the learning question is the most basic one, really, and it's one that not a lot of people have coherence around. And it's very difficult to think about moving forward if you don't have shared language around it. So what we try to do in the book for each one of these questions is to give you a sense of some ways that you can audit where you're at, some questions that you can ask to begin to get a sense of what the baseline is for answering what is sacred or what is learning or the rest of these, but then also to give you a sense of what you can do and what actions you can take in terms of trying to then articulate an answer that is, again, shared and coherent. So just so you know, these are just some starting points that we think might help in terms of engaging in these questions in your communities and moving forward as well. So we're trying to be practical as well as kind of philosophical around this work, which you have to be right now. You have to be able to put ideas into action.
And next we ask a question that has been rather, it could be uncomfortable or it could be really illuminating for a lot of schools. Where is the power? And we know this isn't asked a lot. Where is the power among adults? And do students really have power over their learning and power with the adults that they are learning with? So that is such an important question to be looking into. Why do we fill in the blank? How often do you ask the question, why do we, all these inherited actions and practices and structures, why do we do these things? How often do we get to ask that and do an audit on those structures. Who is unheard? So this kind of goes right to the heart of questions on equity and voice and justice in our schools. So just to demonstrate a little bit of what an audit of who is unheard could look like. For example, look at who is assigned to special education, who is assigned to honors, advanced, and gifted programs. Do those percentages really reflect the community that you're serving? Do your hiring practices recruit and retain diverse faculty and staff that also reflect who you're serving, your community? What are some of the practices there? And then we offer a little bit of toward a new normal is some of the steps that you can take. So looking at your curriculum, looking at who the experts are that you learn from, identifying and collaborating with others, champions who share your commitment to equitable and using that word anti-racist education, whether they work in your building or they don't have to anymore. We've learned that lesson. They might be on the other side of the world. How you might expand your network of who you're in contact with, your professional relationships, well before you have a position to fill. So it doesn't feel like a constant lurching from crisis to crisis. So who is unheard? Next, we ask, are we literate? And that goes to the new literacies that we have to embrace and teach and learn if we are moving forward in this, entering this third decade of the 21st century. Digital literacy, global literacies, racial and cultural competencies and literacies. How do those connect to civics and democracy? Those are really vital questions as we are especially so tech dependent. Are we okay? So this question of wellness seems to have really moved to the fore, that we cannot continue operating schools without acknowledging our integral well-being to the school as faculty and staff and as students. And do our practices sort of contradict our commitment to wellness? And then the question, are we connected? So, we might be more plugged in using technology than we ever have been, but are we really connected to each other, connected to our community, connected as a global learning community? And really questioning those, because we've learned that connection, collaboration, all of that is really vital for moving forward and solving the most challenging problems that we're living in. And then the final question is looking forward. What is next? And we've been really informed by futures thinking and using scenario planning and futures and that fearless inquiry that it's going to take to move forward and not just go back. So that's a little bit of an overview. The book is a really quick read, and we've been really gratified. This is a tweet from yesterday. Andrew, I don't know if you're listening, or any of your staff from New Delhi are on this call, but thanks for sharing that you have been examining these questions. And we've seen around the world, public schools, private schools have been using the questions. Here's in another tweet, somebody shared, this was a note that was on the bulletin board in the staff room, asking these questions and just, starting a process of reflection in the community. And it spurs sort of imagination. And we've been thrilled to learn of so many places that are using this book, free download, don't forget, and just sort of moving forward to ask the questions. So I'm going to turn it to Will to talk about how you might use these questions in a framework.
So, obviously this is a lot to kind of throw at you in a short amount of time, but we do think that there are some new 3 R's for educational leaders in this moment. And that it's really important for us to try to catch a breath, to try to step back a little bit, and to go through a little bit of a process of taking in this moment, trying to understand it more deeply, and trying to clarify what the implications are for us. There are a lot of people who are making lots of predictions, who are doing lots of analysis, and we are sharing lots of those works as well. But we think that the very first thing that we need to do once we can kind of step back from it is just to reflect right now. We are not, we have been changed by these 14 months. We have a, kind of a little throwaway line where we say, certainly it's not 1919 any longer when it comes to thinking about education, but it's actually not 2019 any longer either. And that where we are today, as many people are indicating, has been accelerated probably 5 or 10 years from where we would have been because of COVID and because of this kind of forced technology shift that we've had to make. We need to take a breath and we need to really ask ourselves, who are we? How have we changed? How have we changed as individuals? How have we changed as institutions? How do we think differently about the world? What has been our impact, or the impact on us, and to try to understand that as much as possible. And then, I think we need to have that portal moment that Homa talked about earlier, the Arundhati Roy quote. What are we going to carry through this moment? We have already begun to leave some things behind. There are a lot of people who aren't doing tests any longer, and we'll see if those come back, but certainly we have learned that we can live without some of these major tests. Our kids can actually be okay. And so everything kind of is up on the table. And that sacred question, one of the most interesting things to do when you ask that question in your communities is to make sure you look and see what's not on that list. What doesn't come up on that list when you answer what is sacred? And then ask the question, do we want to carry that forward through this moment? Do we want to continue to do that as we kind of, come out of this very intense moment and enter into another, intense period? There's no question that this uncertainty is going to be with us for a long time. And then once we've kind of made those decisions and we've kind of reset, then we have to think about the future. And we have to ask some big questions about, who do we want to become? What is your aspiration for 15 years down the road? What do you want to have happening in your classrooms? If you could rebuild it from the ground up, what would you build? And then to use those visions, use those futures kinds of scenarios for the teaching and learning that you want to see happening in your schools as a way of benchmarking every decision that you make moving forward. Does this decision get us closer to that particular vision? I think it demands of us a much deeper interrogation of mission and vision. We all have mission and vision statements. When I go into schools and I ask people, what's the mission? What most people do is they go on their phones and they kind of look it up. They try to find it, right? That can't be the case any longer. We have to be mission driven, and we have to have a vision, a very clear vision that all of us are on, in concert with and have coherence around. It's crucial right now as we, again, are in a period of increasing uncertainty. We have to be much clearer on that. So reflect, reset, reinvent. We think that's that's some good work to do when you can carve out the bandwidth for it. Again, we know that this is a really tough moment and that there's still a lot going on that we have to deal with. But if you can start those conversations, it's really important. And to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like in the big picture, we have created this framework that hopefully will make a little bit more sense of it. It looks a little overwhelming, but we're going to break it down.
Yeah. So this is when you do those 3 R's, this is one way that you can see how it looks. So we start, it's a little overwhelming at first when you see the models. So we want to break it down for you a bit. And we start with the fundamental building block are the actors involved. And we start with individuals. So many times our models are just institutional, but we think just as we have weathered this crisis together, individuals, our well-being, our thoughts, our contribution are so crucial to keep at the heart of all of these questions. So we ask the question of individuals, of our institutions like schools, and of our, what do we consider to be our community? And each one will sort of have a slightly different lens to answer the questions at the anchor are, who are we now and what might we become looking forward? And so as we look as individuals, who are we now? That entails examining our purpose in the reflection, a process of really being honest, truth-telling. We think of it as a radical candor. And as we start to reset, we look at our practices, we look forward with reinvention, we redefine roles, and that's a deeply creative process. And then on the other side, as institutions, as we reflect, we need to interrogate our relevance. That's part of our truth-telling and our reflection process. We will examine the narratives, the stories that we tell about school are so overlooked and important. And then reinventing school as we look forward. What might we become? And putting on that sort of creative, imaginative opportunity to dream. And so it all comes together with these dispositions of fearless inquiry and continuous learning, and then anchored by, on the individual side, it's a process of personal growth. On the institutional side, a process of cultural change. And so it's a lot, but we just take it step by step, and we found that actually it's really manageable. And one of the other really rich elements of this process that we've been thrilled to see as groups, as schools take this on, is bringing together a sort of guiding coalition. So it's not just the staff or the leadership that are asking this question, but bring in the parents, bring in the students, learn together, and you will find that you have so much more willingness, understanding, grace between and across these different perspectives. And Will is going to start, Will share just a little bit about the power of community.
Yeah, and so we're going to be taking on some questions here in probably just a couple of minutes, actually. So we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for your questions, and we'd love to get into this conversation a little bit more deeply. Like I said before, we know this is a lot, and so we wanted to save some time to process what's in your heads as well. So we did start a free community of people who want to engage more fully or more consistently in these questions, and we'd like to just invite you to check it out. The address is right there, bqi.community. We have about 850 people right now from around the world, and we're just getting started. We really are ramping up, trying to create some collaborative projects. We're doing some book studies, but really what we're just trying to do is to provide a space where we can engage in a lot of this work together. And it's really important work to do right now. There's no question that this is a historic moment. And I say this a lot, but I think it's so important for us to understand this moment that we're in to the extent that we can understand it. I'm probably not going to be around in 30 or 40 years when someone writes the history of these first couple of decades, these first 2 or 3 decades of the 2000s, but not just what's happened in the last 14 months, but when you think about the internet, when you think about all of the technological differences, all the access, all the connections that we have, the connections to content and people and technology, it's just, it leaves me breathless, actually, when I try to wrap my brain around it. So, just honor that. I think it's really important, and we talk a lot about just remember, this is an historic moment that we're trying to learn our way through. And our kids are going to have to learn their way through probably almost equally historic times that are on our doorstep. And so this is the moment that we have to begin to think deeply about our work. We have to revisit it and be fearless in asking questions about it. And we hope that we've given you a starting point to do that today. But for now, we'd love to hear your questions and to engage in some dialogue with you. So I think I'm kicking it back to you, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Will and Homa. Wonderful. So we've gotten several questions that have come through both in the registration process and in real time here this morning. And I want to combine a couple of these into a question that speaks to something you brought up, and is one of the question about where is the power. And everybody out there is up against forces that go beyond the individual and the individual's will and the individual's desire to make change. And those forces could be governmental, they could be parental. Just starting with those two, the requirements that are on schools externally, some that are real and regulatory, others that are more cultural. What kind of advice might you give to those managing in a world where these questions are important to be asked, but the people in charge of ensuring that the right answers are given may not be the people with all the power and the influence to effect change in these communities? Is that making sense? And what kind of guidance might we offer to schools out there?
You want me to? I'll start with. This is. I feel like you're leading with this big, massive, kind of, what do they call, wicked. It's a wicked question. This is probably one of the most fundamental ones we hear all the time. Governments, testing requirements, parents, like, we don't think we can do these new things because of all those factors that are like breathing down our necks. And Will and I do a lot of work with parent groups as well to help them get a sense of, sorry, I just saw that background rating and I'm laughing.
Nice, Jen.
So we do a lot of work with parents to help them understand, these big questions and help reframe even the way you talk to your children, the way you manifest what you care about. Are you asking them what do you want to be when you grow up? With all that pressure, are you asking them what problem do you want to solve, and starting a conversation so you're not only just lecturing to your kids and pressuring them, because everybody wants their kids to be happy, to thrive, to be okay. So we find that having these conversations, asking these questions with even your regulatory authority, even your public boards and commissions, and everybody was a student once. Everybody has that experience. Sharing that and helping them also open up, because institutions are made of individuals. And when individuals change, they help cultures change. And cultures create systems. It's all connected. And we think of coherence all the time. How do these cohere with our deepest values? It's slower. It's not as efficient of a process. And that's what we're seeing when it comes to equity and racial justice. That's what we're seeing when it comes to power with instead of power over. It's a slower process, but it engaging in conversations about what's sacred, what are your deepest values. And that allows these boards to see we're not serving our students anymore. And we are working with some large public commissions that have power over hundreds of thousands of students, and they are rethinking. I feel very hopeful about the moment that we're in. And I feel like there's an urgency to seize this feeling and seize this moment. Don't let it pass. This is the time to do something about it.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly too. I think the first thing you need to do is acknowledge that there are power relationships that prevent us from really getting to the learning that we want kids to be doing in schools. We have to just acknowledge that. And I think we have to interrogate the different ways in which power plays out. One of the things we suggest to people is create a power org chart. and just map out, where does the power reside? And then finally, everybody talks about agency, and everybody will acknowledge that learners learn best when they have control over their learning. We hear this, who owns the learning, and we want kids, all of that. Well, if we are going to be honest about it, we may say that, but we don't create conditions in classrooms where kids really have a lot of power to pursue things on their own terms. And if we want kids who are learners in the world today, which I think we all want, if we want kids who are going to be able to solve problems and to connect with other people and to do good work in the world, we're going to have to figure out ways of really giving them more agency and choice over what and how and when they learn with us. And if we can help them do that better when they're in school, then I think we stand a much better chance of them being quote unquote successful in that outside of school as well.
Yeah, I think what I hear in part what you're saying, that to answer some of these big questions, you can offer small solutions that might scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's either that or go start a new school, right? I mean, that is a choice. And that is actually an interesting thing. It's an interesting choice that a lot more people are making right now. There are lots of different schools now popping up on the edges from people who have just decided, this is the type of learning we want to have available to children. And this is what's this is what's really going to prepare them for, this kind of different environment in which we live. But if you're not going to choose to do that, then yeah, you make change where you can. And they are small changes on some scale. But what we're saying to a lot of people too is, don't change anything, but have these conversations. Build your capacity to engage in these types of questions, because they will force you, if you're being honest about them, they will force you to begin to take steps that will change the way you think about teaching and learning in the classroom. They have to. Because again, these are foundational to our work.
Right, right. It seems too that part of this global experiment that we fell into last year, we've tested the requirements that learning happens in a building. And of course, kids have had to be remote along with teachers. And I know many families have chosen homeschooling intentionally, well pre-pandemic, obviously, but now even during and after, that may be the mode they're going to work in with their own kids. And there are micropods and other variations on a theme, which raises another kind of big, hairy question, which is, given all of these challenges, all these questions that you've posed, is school, the way we have school, the best place to answer all these questions?
I mean, it depends what we mean by that. Depends what the new school is going to look like. So, this question, the preface to your question about how many people are choosing alternative forms of school, in the United States alone, Black families have opted to homeschool. That increase just among Black families is more than 500% since COVID to homeschool or stay at home. Mm-hmm. And that is a statement on who were schools serving. And, a little bit of who is unheard, a little bit of where's the power. And so, what we've been so excited about is seeing this unleashing of learning. And it may not get reflected on a standardized test, but we're open to brand new possibilities now.
Yeah. Are there any one or two real impressive success stories that you all have encountered in the last year, where people, even in the midst of all this insanity, are showing tremendous promise in addressing the opportunity and embracing a new normal out there?
I think the ones that come to mind are pre-pandemic even, right? I don't think that there's been enough time for those who have maybe felt this disequilibrium to move to a very different model within 12 or 14 months. I mean, it takes much, much longer than that. I mean, we always, just on a kind of a larger national level, We always point to Taiwan, which has over the last 5 years done some amazing work in redesigning the way that education looks in schools. And by the way, like Homa said this before, and just want to reiterate it. We're not suggesting schools should go away. I mean, we both think, and I know most people, if not everybody on this call, believes that schools can be powerful places of learning when kids and adults get together to do, really meaningful and interesting work in the world. And we can show one-off examples of that all over the place, right? But when a nation gets together and says, we can't keep doing this competitive education thing any longer. It's not good for kids. They don't really learn in the ways that we need them and want them to learn. And instead, we're going to change it around and make it really collaborative. And we're going to really learn about the things that are facing kids' lives right now. We're going to make it about the climate issues that are happening. We're going to make it about the justice issues. We're going to make sure that we are steeped in these real world problems and challenges and opportunities, by the way, that are happening right now. And I keep saying, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we do that? That's just like it's kind of astounding to me that we are so wedded to this traditional colonialist curriculum in most cases, when the world has changed dramatically and is shifting dramatically. And what got you here isn't going to get you there, right? It's a very, very different path forward. And here's just one last thing, Jeff, and then I'll be quiet. But just again, on a kind of a different scale, or on a different kind of part of that conversation is, we do a lot of work that tries to distinguish between this idea of narrative and story, and the narrative being kind of the larger arc. The larger narrative of education is absolutely changing. The larger narrative, that this idea that you go to college and you're successful, that still holds true in large part, but it is now beginning to really be reconsidered. And you see this all the time now. You see big corporations, we have another deck where we just throw 3-4 different slides up there that says basically, yeah, we're not looking at college grads. We're not requiring college diplomas any longer for really high paying, really important jobs. We're looking at dispositions. We're looking at literacies and skills. And if kids don't have enough money to go to a really great school, or they don't have the grades, that doesn't matter. There are so many different ways to learn now. There are so many different ways that we can improve our own understanding. And so we actually want kids who are self-directed. We want those kids who are going out there. And so that larger narrative around education was beginning to shift already. The pandemic has accelerated that as well. Right. And so now, if we're just preparing kids in a traditional sense, I would argue we're not preparing them for all of the opportunities and all of the pathways that they have forward as they leave us in the K through 12 systems.
Yeah. Seems that the fact that so many universities have dropped standardized testing as a requirement has forced an opening and a change that had been, I think, lobbied for many years from various quarters. And look, overnight almost, it dropped. And it seems that many places, University of California system, for example, have extended that moratorium on requiring standardized testing. Doesn't solve all the problems, but it seems it does open up opportunities. And I wonder if you can speak to that question, because the educational ladder, as you indicate, is so fixed in the mindset of the culture, not just here in the States, that college is the pathway to a successful life, but internationally, I know that's also the impression. And this is not to say that higher education is not important, but those barriers to higher education that have created certain mindsets and certain conditions in the K-12 world. Do you have hope that those will perhaps change in the new normal?
Just really fast. I'll answer really fast and then let Homa go. If we change the stories that we tell, yes.
Changing the stories we tell, that's a whole, let's pursue that. That's a topic that we are really interested in. But yeah, I see people in the chat are already and will answered, Google, Amazon, Apple. Let's just start with them. They are saying, you know what, if you can't take on the incredible cost of university, at least in the US, the cost of university, we have a certification, you can take it. And all those free Coursera, yep, all those courses. Hey, David Furlow, our friend who's actively on the chat. But there are so many alternatives. And what we see, it's like the market is doing the walking. And I will admit, I have been an alumni interviewer for Princeton admissions, and I found the process deeply heartbreaking, deeply concerning. I haven't done it for a few years because of that. And what we find is, and this is the case in all of these universities, and it's only going to grow, is that their incoming class has not grown. The pool of applicants is many times larger than the size of the pool that they set however many decades ago. And so they could, I just read an article like Harvard could fill its incoming class at least 5 times with who they rejected and be at exactly the same level of standard. So what does that mean for our students? One thing it means, if we start asking them more about what problem you want to solve, they will deeply be committed to problem solving and being responsive to the needs of the world, and not be as hung up on my value is connected, it is dependent on the name brand of where I'm going to school. And employers will feel the same. They will see this person has been a problem solver, because there is no shortage of problems in the world. We were just talking with a school head yesterday who said that if, I think it's like 10% of a high school student's time times every high school student just in the United States were to focus on problem solving, I think he said it's 2 billion hours of time.
Wow.
2 billion hours of human resource capacity towards climate change, conflict resolution. I mean, fill in the blank. I have chills thinking about what can be unleashed if we shift the way we're thinking, and people are doing that. I want to cite an example from a field that is not education as a hopeful sign of change. Yesterday, I think it was publicly announced that it's like the #1 restaurant in the United States. It's, I think, called 11 Madison Avenue or something like that. I'm blanking on the name. It is the top, it is like the best restaurant, okay? They have made a commitment and an announcement that they will only cook, it is only going to use plant-based ingredients. So high haute cuisine, yes, 11 Madison. No butter, no cream, no meat, nothing in all their food. And they said, because we cannot rest on our laurels, it is, the world is burning around us and we have to do something about it. And so we are going to create the best possible food, plant-based, because we have to make the change. No one ever would have imagined that the finest chefs of the world would say, we're not doing that. And since COVID, they dedicate their time to feeding and serving their community. And I would say, tell your students to follow their Instagram account. It's amazingly inspiring. But that's what change is happening. That is what is possible. And looking out to other sectors, we realize that train has left the station. And I want to be on that. I want to be with them, you know?
Yeah, me too. I know we're almost out of time, but let's just run a few minutes late if it's okay with you two. And those of you able to stay on the webinar, please stay on for a few more minutes, because I see a lot of good questions still coming in. Now, you know, one comment is that it seems to me much of what you're describing is the value of storytelling, the importance of courage, stepping out, even if you're the only restaurant doing this. Looking out for each other. These are age-old things. This is not necessarily 21st
Yeah.
century, is it?
Yes, it's ancient wisdom.
But it's interesting that you mentioned courage and storytelling in the same sentence, Jeff, because I think that's a part of it, right? So one of the most powerful stories that I've had, or conversations that I've had in the last 5 years, was actually with a public school principal up in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been talking a lot, over some time about storytelling and about, making choices about that. And one day he just said, you know what? I've just decided that I'm just not going to tell the stories that I used to tell about success at my school. And, on my blog, it's great that you're a national merit semifinalist, and that's all good. And I'm not saying you shouldn't, pursue that, but I'm not telling that story anymore. I'm telling stories about kids who are out in the community and who are doing really good work with people and who are building things and creating solutions to the problems that they're facing. Those are the stories I'm going to choose to tell. I'm not going to do test scores. I'm not going to do AP scores. I'm not going to do those things any longer. And, it's a reminder to all of us. It's a choice. We can choose what stories we tell. And if we stop telling old stories, that's why I was kind of flipped there a couple minutes ago when you said, what will make change happen? We have to change the stories that we tell. If parents all of a sudden are reading stories about kids who are doing amazing work, it's not going to happen overnight. But a lot more of them are going to say, yeah, I want that for my kid. Instead of, yeah, I want the, 18 AP scores or whatever, classes or whatever else. We have to change the narrative, the stories that fit this new narrative that's happening, right? And what Homa's restaurant example is, it's just this new kind of different narrative that's happening in the world right now. We are aligning ourselves now with different motives, with different outcomes. And schools are going to do this. They're not, they will change eventually, but the question becomes, how fast is that going to happen, and how much energy do we put into that? And one way is to just choose different stories to tell. I mean, I think that's a great starting point.
Yeah, and we can create some of those own stories ourselves now.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But there's not a person on this call right now who's in a school where those stories aren't already happening.
Right.
They're already happening on the edges, or sometimes maybe in the mainstream. But it's still a choice about which stories we choose to communicate that define what we feel success is.
That's great. That's
great.
great.
And to see as part of your leadership mandate is telling the story. There's a power question of the stories that you tell. So that's a conscious decision that schools can take.
And maybe that's a final thought, Homa, but I just want to ask if there's, just in the closing minute or so here, if you have a final message, final thought to share with the audience today.
Well, I'm so inspired and moved. We have a quote. We didn't share it in the presentation, so I'll share it now, that I just am getting so much energy and hope from the hundreds of participants that have stayed on since we started this session and going a little over time, is the idea that hope is a discipline, and that it can be, you manifest that through action. And Mariam Kaba, who's a really wonderful activist, and her book just hit her new book just hit the bestseller list. But to be anchored in hope, but to push forward with discipline, that we can realize what we have hope in and hope about.
Yeah, and I would just say, as fraught as this moment is, it requires us to be fearless. It just requires us to be fearless. We're not going to solve these problems by shying away from them. And I think that the more that we can be fearless in our work, the more that our communities can be fearless, and we can create kids who are fearless. I think that's going to bode much more positively for all of our futures. So sincere best wishes on your work, everyone. And thanks again, Jeff, for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you, Homa. You've given us lots to think about. We have your ebook as well to reflect on, and people can follow up directly with you, I know, if they have further questions or interest in engaging. And I look forward to seeing you again, not just on the screen, but someday in person. And again, grateful for the guidance, some of the light that you shined for all of us today. And thank goodness for the two of you doing the work that you're doing, and please keep it up.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Homa and Will, for joining us, and for everyone that attended and asked questions. It was a really great session today. So again, we want to thank you for your attendance, and for our panelists, my co-host Jeff, and everyone at NEASC. I'm Allison Geary. Thank you and take care.